Next up is the architect Michael McClelland, and the title of his talk is Everyday Modern Architecture. Michael.
It's me again. I'm going to do the same thing I did in the morning. I'm going to try and keep my talk fairly brief, because maybe we can have a panel discussion afterwards and we can talk, and everybody's got lots of things to say, so I'll try and keep it brief. I was supposed to talk about brutalism and architecture of the centenary, but other people were talking about the centenary, so I thought I'll shift my topic slightly. I brought two books. The Concrete Toronto book is the basis of what I'm kind of talking about, and we've donated a bunch of copies to the ACO. It's a good read. But also downloadable from our site is two books called North York's Modernist Architecture, and you can download them. And we worked with a whole bunch of people to produce those books. And the thesis behind those books were, more than 20 years ago, the city of North York, before amalgamation, listed 200 buildings that they thought were modernist buildings, they were of heritage value, and they wanted them recognized and protected. That's 200 buildings. That was more than 20 years ago, recognized by the municipality. Maybe 30 or 40 of them made them onto the City of Toronto's inventory. 50 of them have been demolished. So there's a process about, it's a bit like, it actually was interesting this morning, we were talking about things being found, or from an Indigenous point of view, things being lost, and how do you recover them, and how do you identify the things that have value. And even Madeline's talk about the Humber River was about rediscovering this thing. And so I think the presentation I'm going to do right now is a little bit about just questioning and rediscovering and kind of understanding and appreciating it. The Concrete Toronto book had started off because I said I'm an architect, I'd be in an elevator, I'm an architect, and the person that's beside me would say, well, you must hate Robarts Library. And it was that initial kind of discussion got me going. And I said, no, actually, I really love the Robarts Library, and trying to understand and spread out the appreciation for things that I thought were interesting and valuable. So today's talk, so I would say that a lot of modern architecture in Toronto is now getting to be well recognized and respected, but there's a lot that's not. And I'm calling it everyday modern architecture. And it's the architecture that people live in and appreciate. Now, we have very famous pieces of architecture in Toronto. This is Mies van der Rohe's TD Centre. I just met with Phyllis Lambert last month and talked to her, and she said this is the best piece of Mies in the world, the largest collection of Mies buildings, well-maintained anywhere in Toronto. We have other cool examples. This is the new Google headquarters. It used to be Peter Dickinson's office, and so there's the restored version of the Peter Dickinson office lobby. So now I think a lot of, especially in this crowd, I think a lot of people go, Peter Dickinson, of course. But what people don't, I think, recognize is that Toronto is a concrete city. Toronto is a city about a lot of concrete, and concrete still has a stigma. You can look at beautiful buildings like this guy, immediately recognized, and actually if you go up close, if you walk up onto the upper level, go up close to those concrete walls because they're all inlaid with marble. So it's beautiful, beautiful, immaculate work. And so when people talk about brutalism, they're actually talking about the hand that touches. It's a rough cast piece. And standing beside this thing, I don't think I need to say more. This is a piece of precast. And John, where's John? John. Yeah, John, the guy, put your hand up again. That guy was the project architect for this building. And if you want to learn how to pour concrete, I think you talk to him, because there's all kinds of methods of how you get the wood grain to read in the concrete, if you walk around this building, there's so many different treatments of concrete that are immense. And the idea behind that was to get people to think about a plastic material that was a not expensive material. You didn't have to build a major public building out of granite or other noble materials. You could use concrete, and you could do whatever form you wanted. So it was amazingly liberating, just like this guy was amazingly liberating. A lot of brutalism, a lot of buildings that are called brutalist are pretty tough. They often have a massive scale. They often are people go, now they're kind of afraid of them sometimes. But the intent was, you have to think from an aesthetic point of view, they weren't talking about the beautiful, they were talking about the sublime, things that would actually impress in a level of being sublime. They were not about being cute being expressing immense power and strength. So this is the Ross Building, and Bill Greer probably had a lot to do with. Did you have something to do with the Ross Building, Bill? Yeah. Okay. And the library. But even common buildings around the city, the Manulife Center by Laurie, Clifford Laurie. The intent of the Manulife Center was that it would be a city within the city. So you could live in, I used to live in the Manulife Center, you could go down shopping with your slippers on. You could go see a movie with your slippers on. And it had a kind of urban quality and character to it that was unlike anything else that Toronto had ever seen before. Then you get the Roberts Library. And the Roberts Library, Mayers and Holdenby were the local architects, but they're primarily New York architects who did the design. This has been called the best brutalist building in the world. And so I'm not sure whether I totally agree with that, even understand what that concept would be. But an amazingly large building. Again, the scale's massive. It ranks as one of the largest university libraries in North America. And it was a time of optimism in building it. And in fact, the scale of the building was supposed to be the base height for what got built around that neighborhood. And of course, there became a lot of reactions against the scale of these buildings. And it's something that's gone amazingly into an unpopular fashion. So I'd like to posit, first of all, that buildings go through cycles of appreciation. So when you're hitting 40, 50, 60 years old, you're almost like a person. People start to pay less attention to you because you're old, right? So you're not regarded as new and innovative. You're not really regarded as old enough to be historic. You're in this middle zone, which is the zone most threatening for architecture. It's a zone where most things get demolished because they're regarded as obsolete. And you get Scarborough College, John Andrews. I think this is a perfect example of the sublime. Just a stunning complex of buildings. And John Andrews, of course, also brought us the CN Tower. So these were all major gestures, major significant pieces of infrastructure. You could also think of parts of the subway system as being part of this concrete infrastructure that was introduced at this time. But in terms of everyday modern architecture, what I'd like to suggest is that we need to look at the rest of the city. And this is actually almost taken from where we are. This overlooking Thorncliffe. Where we are, by the way, at this building, which is this amazing example of what I'm talking about, is the geographic center of Metro. So there's a plaque upstairs in the floor. It says this is the actual epicenter of Toronto. These are the buildings, these apartment buildings that are throughout the city, all concrete, were terribly innovative for the time. They're the buildings we all love to hate right now. They're the buildings that have the stigma. They're the buildings that people aren't appreciating. And I'd like to go to bat for them and say, in fact, they're extremely interesting. So communities like Thorncliffe were a 70s planning idea about how to do smart planning. And for 30, 40 years, they held off the spell of sprawl. They were an antidote to sprawl. So the city of Toronto has very dense neighborhoods, very dense suburban neighborhoods. So for example, unlike any North American city, so we're twice as dense as Chicago because of these neighborhoods that create huge density. There's more than 1 million people live in apartment towers built in Toronto that were built in the 60s and 70s. So there's a huge amount of building stock. And so we all, as people interested in history, we all think, brownstones, they're amazing because they're that of an age that we can now appreciate them as heritage buildings. But in 40 years, we're going to be looking apartment towers, amazing, because they create such an intense amount of building stock for the city of Toronto. So 2/3 of our rental housing is in aging apartment towers. This is the peanut, for obvious reasons. You can figure that These neighborhoods were built for the middle class, and it worked very well if you had a car, because you could just hop in a car and go do your shopping. It was all kind of regional planning, very, very carefully thought out. It's planning, very smart planning. What's happened, however, is that the demographics have changed. People who live in these towers no longer have cars, and the City of Toronto hasn't kept up with its infrastructure. So we don't have the accessibility, the mobility to these neighborhoods. So we're now getting a very interesting shift in our city. David Holchansky calls it the three cities. The people in the downtown core are rich and have access to good transit, and people in the suburbs are poor and they have no access to transit. And the middle, the number two part of the city is disappearing. That's the middle class. Where in the 1970s, the majority of the city was a middle class city. It's now disappeared. So it's time for us, and I think Architecture Conservancy could jump into this, for us to think about the architecture of the 70s, and to understand it as an issue for conservation, to understand that these buildings are corroding and falling apart for a whole bunch of reasons, and they need to be evaluated and looked at carefully. Some of them are cuter than others. So these are Uno Pre buildings. And Uno was a wonderful man. Uno phoned me once and says, "Michael, this is Uno." And he invited me out for dinner. But he was very interested in making characterful buildings. He was an engineer as well as an architect, so he could actually move the rebar around to create some forms and cost nobody any extra money. But his buildings are everyday modern buildings. And some of them are more interesting than others. And then some of the ones that he didn't do are even plainer, but they have many of the characteristics. You can still see this kind of detail appearing in some of these buildings. This is one of his buildings before it was ravaged and the balconies were all ripped off on Walmer Road. And they have character. These ones are now being appreciated. Now people go, "Oh, we must designate this building as a heritage building." That's a very, if you're dealing with 2,000 or 3,000 buildings, one-at-a-time designation isn't maybe the right approach to do. You need to kind of think through more carefully how to deal with these buildings. We had to deal with the Uno Pre building recently. It had these wonderful precast balconies. They had to be removed because they were falling apart. Birds were living in them, and the building department said they were climbable. So we had to take them out. We replaced them with fritted glass, matching the pattern. And this isn't something you would do in regular conservation with a heritage building, but it's a kind of triage impact of trying to fix something where there's no extra money to address the needs that were there. So it's now a fritted glass pattern. And it's become a very popular thing to do with Uno Pre buildings now, I understand. So one last slide. This is my last slide. This building looks like it's been through the wars. It was on Driftwood Avenue. It was designed by Irving Grossman. It was one of the 200, no longer with us. And it's very interesting. You look at this building with an idea of a stigma and say, what a horrible, I wouldn't want to live there, what a horrid thing. You could also look at it, understand Uno Pre was one of the most intellectually interesting architects of his time living in Toronto. He'd studied as a student with Rudolf Schindler in California. He was an artist, very interesting guy. If you looked at this and squinted a bit and thought Russian constructivist, you'd be close. The idea that it was actually an extremely innovative building form. It had a ground plan you could walk under and through. It had very interesting units. It's now gone. So this is my last slide on the basis of asking how we move from the ugly to the sublime, how we understand the character buildings and how we appreciate them. And just to put it into a different mindset, if you think of Old City Hall, for about 60 years of its history, people were thinking, how can we blow this thing up? How can we get rid of Old City Hall? It's a hideous, quirky old Victorian building. What we now appreciate is Richardsonian Romanesque and wonderful carving and beautiful balanced design. That only came with appreciation. So I'm just asking people to start thinking about these buildings from this period and think about that idea of understanding these buildings better. Thanks.